I've been asked to address the issue of a pastoral perspective on domestic abuse. How many pastors are here today? Well, good. I was thinking that I might be the only one here with a pastoral background. How many of you sit under the ministry of a pastor? Many more of us. My remarks today, although geared from a pastoral perspective, are for all of us who deal with this very troubling problem. In 1995, the film Apollo 13, depicting the planned third lunar landing, the star commander of that film was Tom Hanks. And you remember those lines which have become a part of our culture today, when the electrical and mechanical systems and the oxygen system was failing in Apollo 13. The commander gave those famous words, "Houston, we have a problem." And today, 21st century church, evangelical church, we have a problem still. I encountered this problem my first year of being a pastor. I graduated from Gordon Divinity School in 1964, 49 years ago now, the precursor to Gordon-Conwell Theological Seminary. I'm grateful for my theological education, a classical one, Greek, Hebrew, New Testament, Old Testament, theology, church history. What was missing? Practical theology. I don't fault the seminary. That's the way it was done then, and I'm grateful for that. It gave me a foundation which has really helped me through all these years of ministry, so I don't take that lightly. But in my first month of being a pastor in Rockport at Pigeon Cove Chapel, a 15-year-old girl came in to see me, sophomore in high school, and she said, "Pastor Ken, I'm pregnant." I knew at some point, at least I thought at some point, I would face that situation, but I didn't expect it in my first month. For some reason, I said, "Well, do you know who the father is?" Not real sure what I was going to do with that piece of information, but it seemed important at the time. Actually, I do know what I was going to do with that. I was going to say, "Could the father of your child then step up and be the man?" She said, "Oh, yes, it's my father." And I didn't know what to say. Talked to fellow clergy, and they all said, "Well, we've been through this as well. We have a problem. We know it's a problem. We don't really know what to do about it." Now, remember, that was 1964. Were that to happen today, it'd be a far different story. That father would be in jail. At the time, we didn't do that kind of thing. Thankful that I had a church that really surrounded this young woman and walked with her through that pregnancy. And I've had touch with this woman just in the last couple of years, and she's really doing wonderfully well in spite of that horrific beginning to being a parent in her part. But that was my introduction to this problem. You're going to hear statistics. You've heard some already. 1/3 of women over the age of 18 in America have experienced some kind of abuse from somebody they know. Think about that in terms of people in the congregations where you are serving or living. 10 to 12% of men over the age of 18 have also been abused. I'm addressing my remarks primarily to the reality of the male perpetrator of abuse, because 95% of the perpetrators are male. Stephen Tracy, professor of theology and ethics at Phoenix Seminary in Arizona, cites a survey that was done of Maricopa County of 600 women who were battered by an acquaintance, somebody they knew, or their husband or boyfriend. 85% of those women indicated that they were Christians. 57% said that they attended church regularly, but only 7% said that they felt that they could speak to their pastor about this problem. Another study of 1,000 battered women indicated that 67% had attended church or did attend church regularly. 1/3 sought help from clergy. That would be 333 of 1,000 sought help from their pastor, but only 1/3 of that 2/3 said that the pastor was even remotely helpful to them. Kathy Kroeger, for whom this conference is named, in her newsletter of the Peace and Safety in the Christian Home in February 2009, cited that 1,500 women a year are killed by their domestic partners in the United States. 40% of the battered women in the U.S. attempt suicide at some point. 25% of the suicides by women in the U.S. are victims of abuse. 50% of African American women are victims of abuse. I'm teaching a Sunday school class at my home church, Hamilton Congregational Church, this fall, and we're looking at issues that affect Christians and how all of us can come alongside people who are struggling with one issue or another. And last Sunday we talked about anxiety, how we can work with people who are going through an anxious period. And in preparation for that, I was doing some research on statistics just last month. And I was surprised when I saw that PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, affects more women than it does men, PTSD being one of the forms of anxiety. And I thought, I don't quite get that. We hear all the military statistics about PTSD affecting men and women, primarily men, coming out of these horrible war situations. But digging a little deeper, I began to see why more women experience PTSD than men, and the reason you can guess is domestic violence. It just goes on and on and on in the being of the person, as our president has so well said, in the effects of the soul of the person today, all that. Another study says that 31% of the deaths of women not dying from natural causes in America are due to domestic violence. 31%. I live in Ipswich, 6 miles north of here. Our weekly newspaper, the Ipswich Chronicle, has the police log in it. And I'm, like everybody else, a bit of a voyeur, and I like to read through the police log, hoping not to see my name there, but also curious about some of my neighbors. And I am saddened to see the high number of incidents in that police log, which covers about a half a page of the paper, of the police coming to a residence on such and such street. They never give the name, they never give the exact address, but to address a domestic violence situation. And the high number of violations of restraining orders that are listed in the police log there. I have a friend who's a retired judge in Suffolk Court. Herman Smith is his name, very active man at Park Street Church in Boston, where I was a member and leader for some years. Mr. Smith, as a judge, presided over the Suffolk County Court where domestic violence cases were handled. And he says that restraining orders are a joke. That's a quote. They don't mean diddly squat. We've got a problem. Even when legally we try to address the problem, it isn't working. It's a problem outside the United States as well. I have a real interest in Ukraine, been over there many times, served on the board of a school, was teaching in that school in Kyiv, Ukraine. an open symposium at the beginning of that school's year with about 150 students there. It's called a seminary. We would call it a Bible college because of the age of the students who were there. And the president of the school asked me to address this topic, which I was happy to do. As we came to the Q&A time afterwards, one of the men students in that group stood up and he said, "Sir, the Bible says that the husband is the head of the wife, and therefore he can do whatever he needs to do to make the wife submit to him." Now, that is not what Ephesians and Colossians is talking about, and you know that. We went back and forth in our discussion a little bit, and I would like to say it was cordial, but it got a little testy. And when he made that statement that the husband is the head of the wife and therefore he can do what he needs to make her submit, all the boys in the class clapped. I asked him at the end of our discussion in front of everybody, "Are you single?" And he said, "Yes." And in my not so nice response, I said, "I am glad. I hope you stay that way. Because you're not going to be a good husband. You're not going to be a good pastor. You're not going to be good for the church." At that point, all the women clapped. It's even a problem for pastors. I'm embarrassed and ashamed to acknowledge that, though it's not been a problem in my own home, and I'm grateful for that. In the book Battered into Submission by James and Phyllis Alsdorf, it is the research that Jim did in his PhD program at Fuller Seminary, where he looked at all the educated professions, doctors, lawyers, educators, clergy, business people. Of all of those groups, clergy, evangelical clergy, had the highest rate of domestic violence of male perpetrators to their wives. That study has not been replicated, I hasten to add, and some people have questioned that statistic, but you get that book and read it, Battered into Submission, and you'll see what he talks about there. What's happened? I think it's male headship run amok. Our president has eloquently stated that there's no place in the Bible for this kind of a problem. So what do we do? We who are pastors, we who live under pastor's ministry, what are some things we can do? Here's my to-do list. Number one, we need to get over the shock, or the denial, or the ignorance, or the fear of the problem, begin to take it seriously. It's here. We cannot ignore it. We cannot think, as some pastors do, it's not happening in my church. If it were, I would know about it. Yeah, right. I got a bridge in Florida to sell you too, if that's what you believe. One pastor I read the statistic that 50% of evangelical men in churches in America today struggle with pornography. And there's a great correlation between pornography and male abusers. This pastor didn't believe that statistic was true in his church, a very large church. Again, this attitude, if it were happening in my church, I would know about it. So he did an anonymous survey of the men in his church. You ever struggle with pornography? Are you currently struggling with pornography? And to his utter amazement, 60%, 60 of the men in his church admitted in that anonymous survey that this was a problem, an issue for them. So we cannot assume this is not happening because we don't see it. In this case, seeing is not believing. Don't trust appearances. So what can we do? Be observant. Watch for bruises. Watch for lame excuses. Watch for how a woman behaves. Does she seem afraid? Do you see her husband not treating her with respect in a public kind of setting, although often they will be respectful there, but not in private? But watch for the little clues. If we're sensitized to the fact that this is a problem, then I think we may be more alert to the reality of what is going on. Number 2, if you suspect that abuse is happening, be courageous and confront the issue. Or I like the word that David Augsburger, a Mennonite pastoral counselor, he likes to use the word carefront instead of confront. Because we care about people. We can come alongside gently, respectfully, always with the attitude that I may be wrong, but here's what I observe. We don't do this in front of the husband, of course, because that would run a high risk of things being worse for the woman. But just gently to ask, is everything okay at home? I don't know what it's like in other states, but here in Massachusetts, every time I go to the doctor, which at my age is becoming more frequent, I always get asked the question, are you safe at home? Do you feel safe at home? I asked the nurse just recently, I said, if I said yes to that question, what would you do? And she said, I would have to report it. And some kind of an investigation would be done discreetly. Well, can we take a lesson from that? If you get a sense that something is happening to a person in your church, you come alongside. Remember, they may not immediately say, yes, I'm struggling with an issue here. Sure, you'll hear from Nancy Nason-Clark later this afternoon about how this works, how many times a woman will think about this before she ever really acts on it. So don't be surprised if they say, oh, no, everything's fine. Doing all right. Thank you for your interest. Just tuck that away and keep it in mind, because you have to let them move at a pace that they're willing to move. But be willing to confront it, to carefront it, to talk to the person, to come alongside and see if there's some help that you can give as pastor and as congregation. Number 3, to put it as bluntly as I can, don't give stupid advice, even if it's well-intentioned. Among the many things I've done here at the school was direct what we called then our supervised ministry program, now called mentored ministry. At that time, we asked the students to give us a reflection paper on some critical incident of ministry that's happened to them during their semester in their church work. One fellow wrote his reflection paper on a woman who came to him and said, my husband is abusing me. And as they talked about that, what he said to her was, well, you need to be a better wife. And yeah, your response to that shows that that is absolutely the worst thing that you can say. The better she is, the worse he's going to be. So when I read his paper, he got a memo from me saying, can we talk? And came in. We had a nice time talking about the issue. And I think he began to realize, even before he came to me, that the advice he gave simply doesn't work. I know a woman whose husband graduated from this school, who was a pastor for some years, and who abused this wife terribly. Their pastor knew about it when he was in seminary, even talked to the young man and said, are you abusing your wife? And to his surprise and mine, as I know the story, the young man said, yes, I am. And his pastor said, well, don't do it again. The pastor then spoke to the wife and said, I talked to him and he won't do it again. I mean, that is just plain stupid advice. It doesn't happen that way that people get over it. And don't refer the person to anger management. Anger management can help. But anger is not the root of the problem. Control is the root of the problem. And when one cannot control, then one gets angry. So study it enough to know what are some of the good things that we can say to people. Number 4, what are the resources in the community? Know those resources. Hospitals that are available to people if there is no safe home or shelter in your area. If you have opportunity, if you haven't already done so, find out about the shelters in your community. In the pastoral skills track for the Doctor of Ministry program here, which my colleague who's here today, David Curry, and I co-mentor, and Nancy Nason Clark always comes and gives a presentation when we're dealing with this issue of abuse. We give the D.Min students there an assignment that they have to go to a shelter, a safe home, and find out what that's all about. Now, many times they can't go there because it's a protected space that nobody can know about, and that's fine, but at least they can call that shelter and get some information. What these pastors have discovered is that the staff at this shelter are very suspicious of a pastor calling because they see pastors as part of the problem because of some of the dumb advice that they know pastors have given. But as these pastors say, look, I'm in this program, this is an assignment, please help me fulfill this assignment, I need to know about what you're doing, many of these men and women in our cohort have been turned around in their thinking about what's available. They get into these places, they see what's done, and they become an ally for that shelter as well. Learn about the resources that are available in your community. What kind of counseling is available there? Not only for the victim, but also for the perpetrator, if that is a possibility. How long is the stay? Are children involved? What kind of protections are there? That kind of experience and knowledge can be very helpful as well. Find out about some resources for abusers as well. Counseling, accountability groups. And accountability groups, the studies show, are one of the most effective ways in which men, perpetrators, can begin to deal honestly with this issue, with other men who are themselves in the process of working through this and who know when to call a bluff a bluff. Know the resources. Number 5, get your church on board to deal with the issue. Have a place in your church building where people who may be experiencing some kind of abuse can get information without their husband knowing about it. Shoe cards, little brochures that women can tuck in their purse that are available in the women's bathrooms where men are not involved. That kind of information can be very helpful as well. Develop a core of women who understand abuse, who can help somebody who is going through that. They can be a first line of support, and you can help to set that up. Perhaps even have a small group available of women who have been abused and therefore are themselves the best suited to help women who are struggling with this issue themselves. And perhaps even prepare a safe home within your congregation where a woman and her children can go if they need to find a place and are reluctant to go to a shelter, or if there's not even a shelter within 100 miles of their home, which is the case in rural America a great deal. Number 6, talk about the problem. As a leader, as a pastor, be willing to talk about the problem. Scriptures are full of God's commands for how we need to respect each other, and there is no place for abuse anywhere in the Scripture. Three times in the last couple of years, I've had opportunities to preach in other churches. I'm not a regular pastor anymore, but go into churches as a guest speaker, and when the text allows itself to get at this issue, I've been quick to do that, to talk about the problem of abuse in American churches today, in evangelical churches today. I try to do it graciously and in a way that any children there are not going to be scared of what I'm talking about, but nevertheless to talk about it. In every one of those experiences, I've been surprised, but shouldn't have, at the responses I get from people. Very little response at the door when people go out and shake my hand. The responses come in the notes and the phone calls and the emails afterwards from women who say, thank you for talking about that problem. This has been my experience. This is my experience. Can we talk? On one occasion, church south of Boston in Easton, a man came up to me afterwards on that message and he says, that was a courageous message. I was preaching from 1 Peter on men respecting their wives, wives being the weaker sex, and tried to explain in biblical context what that was, and talked about it because the text lends itself to that in terms of there's no place there for the man to in any way force submission on his wife. In fact, what Peter says is, if you do that, it's going to affect your spiritual life. It affects your walk with God. And I talked about that. Again, I think in appropriate kind of ways. This man shook my hand and he says, that was a courageous message. I thought he might be referring to that, but I wasn't sure. So I said, what do you mean courageous? And he said, when you talked about domestic violence, that was a courageous thing to do. Well, folks, I am anything but courageous. My wife can tell you that. My kids can tell you that. I shrink from conflict. I don't like it. But what it says to me is that when somebody says that's courageous, it's because it's different. In our churches, in our women's fellowship groups, in our men's breakfasts and Bible studies, in our youth ministry, let's talk about this issue. Christians are willing to talk about abortion. They're less likely to talk about divorce now than in a generation gone by. But occasionally I'll hear somebody say, God said in Malachi, I hate divorce. And my question always is, and what's the next phrase? Few people remember that next phrase. I hate violence. I hate covering of violence. God hates it. If he hates it, we better take it seriously. I have some notes here about what we can say to people who are affected by abuse, but I think that my colleague, Dr. Polishuk, and I know Dr. Nathan Clark will be saying some things about that too. So I think I'll skip over that with this concluding word from Scripture. Both a warning and a promise. It's what I call a bad news, good news text from Ezekiel 34. Hear the word of the Lord, you shepherds. Shepherds being a euphemism for leaders, pastors, Christian leaders. Hear the word of the Lord, you shepherds. As surely as I live, declares the sovereign Lord, because my flock lacks a shepherd and so has been plundered and has become food for all the wild animals, and because my shepherds did not search for my flock, but cared for themselves rather than for my flock. Not that they weren't there, but that they were not responding to the needs of the flock is what he's getting at here. Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says, I am against the shepherds, and I will hold them accountable for my flock. I will remove them from tending the flock so that the shepherds can no longer feed themselves. I will rescue my flock from their mouths, and it will no longer be food for them. For this is what the sovereign Lord says, I myself will search for my sheep and look after them. The bad news, God says, I'm against the shepherds, the pastors, the leaders who do not take care of the flock. And I'll hold them accountable. There are a number of scripture passages that keep me lying awake at night, and this is one of them. I've got to stand before a holy God in the coming age and give an account for what I've done, whether it's good or bad. The good news of this text is God said, I will look after my flock. Sometimes it doesn't happen as soon as we'd like it to happen, in the way we'd like it to happen. Sometimes there are disastrous, long-lasting effects of abuse. Going to hear some stories today about that. But in reality, God is a God of hope. And in the coming generation, it's all going to be put right. So God said, I will rescue my flock. If you fail, I will not fail. And thanks be to God for that. Thank you.